From ancient civilizations to global superpower, America, the complete story of a nation. 15,000 years of history, a journey through triumph and adversity, the enduring spirit of a nation.
Roughly 20,000 years ago, during the last Great Ice Age, the world looked dramatically different from anything alive today has ever witnessed. Sea levels had dropped so significantly, with so much of the planet's water locked inside massive glaciers, that a broad stretch of land connected what is now Siberia to what is now Alaska, a landmass historians call Beringia. Across this frozen corridor, small bands of hunter-gatherers followed the animals they depended upon for survival. Woolly mammoths, giant bison, caribou, and horses, whose descendants would eventually disappear entirely from the Americas until European ships brought them back millennia later. These travelers were not making a conscious decision to discover a new continent. They were simply following food across a landscape they could not have known was an unprecedented threshold. Behind them lay Asia. Ahead lay an empty continent of staggering geographic diversity, towering mountain ranges, vast interior plains, dense temperate forests, arid southwestern deserts, and a coastline stretching for thousands of miles along two separate oceans. North America, unoccupied by any human being, waited in extraordinary silence. Over centuries and millennia, the descendants of these first arrivals spread southward and eastward, adapting with remarkable creativity to every environment they encountered. Population grew, communities developed, languages multiplied. The first great communities of North America were emerging, and what they would build over the following millennia deserves far more recognition than most historical narratives provide. By the time European ships crossed the Atlantic in the late 15th century, North America was not an empty wilderness awaiting discovery. It was a continent inhabited by perhaps 50 to 100 million people, organized into hundreds of distinct nations, each with its own language, spiritual traditions, governance structures, and cultural practices, developed across thousands of years of continuous civilization. In the Pacific Northwest, communities dependent on the extraordinary salmon runs of major rivers developed complex hierarchical societies whose elaborate ceremonial traditions, including the potlatch system of wealth redistribution, demonstrated sophisticated approaches to economic organization and social obligation. On the Great Plains, nations whose cultures would eventually become deeply associated with the horse had already developed intricate relationships with the vast bison herds whose seasonal migrations organized much of plains life. In the eastern woodlands, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, the Iroquois League, had established a sophisticated political union among 5 and later 6 nations whose governing principles, including representative councils, checks on executive power, and the importance of consensus decision-making, later impressed and influenced some of the European thinkers who were simultaneously developing their own ideas about republican government. In the southeast, large agricultural communities maintained permanent towns and extensive trade networks. Across the desert southwest, Pueblo peoples had built multi-story stone and adobe structures of enduring architectural quality. Complex civilizations were developing across the entire continent. Long before European exploration reached North America, the continent had already witnessed the rise and decline of civilizations whose achievements were genuinely remarkable by any comparative standard. The ancestral Puebloans of the Colorado Plateau
The river
built
is
the
near.
extraordinary
We rest
cliff
there.
dwellings of Mesa
Look,
Verde
mammoths by
and
the
massive
water.
great houses
So
of Chaco
big!
Canyon, a
The
regional
little one is
center
tired.
of such architectural and
We stop
organizational
here,
sophistication
drink and rest.
that its influence extended across an area of roughly 100,000 square kilometers. Through trade networks carrying turquoise, macaws, and other prestige goods across enormous distances. Cahokia, located near the confluence of the Missouri and Mississippi rivers in what is now Illinois, reached its peak around 1100 AD as a city of perhaps 20,000 people, larger at that time than any contemporary city in England, organized around a central plaza dominated by Monk's Mound, an earthwork structure whose volume exceeds that of the Great Pyramid of Giza. These were not isolated achievements. They reflected traditions of agricultural intensification, long-distance trade, and political organization that had been developing across North America for thousands of years, producing diverse regional civilizations whose specific forms responded to the particular environmental and historical conditions of their locations. The fact that European exploration disrupted and in many cases destroyed these civilizations before they could be fully documented by literate observers represents an incalculable historical loss. Yet even this incomplete picture demonstrates clearly that when European ships finally arrived, they were not discovering an empty or primitive land. Strangers crossing the ocean were about to encounter a world already ancient with human achievement. When Christopher Columbus reached the Caribbean in 1492, he believed he had found a new route to Asia. He was wrong about the geography, but right about the significance. His voyages initiated a period of European exploration and exploitation that permanently transformed both the Americas and Europe, creating connections across the Atlantic Ocean that would reshape global history with consequences still unfolding today. Spanish explorers, conquistadors like Hernán Cortés in Mexico and Francisco Pizarro in Peru, rapidly established the pattern of European engagement with American civilizations, combining military conquest, religious conversion, and economic extraction in ways that caused devastating mortality through both direct violence and the catastrophic spread of Old World diseases to populations with no prior immunity. In North America, the process of contact, conflict, and dispossession unfolded over a longer period and through more varied interactions, with French traders in the St. Lawrence Valley, Spanish missionaries in Florida and the Southwest, and English settlers along the Atlantic coast, each developing different relationships with indigenous nations whose responses ranged from alliance and trade to sustained military resistance. Hernando de Soto's brutal expedition through the American Southeast in the early 1540s documented large, densely populated towns, while simultaneously introducing diseases that devastated those populations before the next European explorers arrived. The demographic catastrophe inflicted on indigenous North Americans by European contact, with population estimates suggesting declines of 50 to 90% in many regions, represents one of the most significant demographic events in human history. Permanent settlements were already beginning. The establishment of permanent European colonies along North America's Atlantic coast during the early 17th century created communities whose survival was far from guaranteed, and whose development across subsequent decades shaped the political, cultural, and economic foundations upon which the United States would eventually be built. The Virginia colony at Jamestown, founded by English settlers in 1607, survived its desperate early years through a combination of luck, assistance from the Powhatan Confederacy, whose territory they occupied, and the eventual discovery that tobacco could be cultivated profitably for European markets. The Pilgrim settlement at Plymouth in 1620, followed by the much larger Puritan migration to Massachusetts Bay through the 1630s, established a New England colonial culture whose emphasis on communal self-governance, literacy, and religious community created distinctive political and social patterns. The Dutch colony of New Netherland, centered at New Amsterdam on Manhattan Island, brought a commercial, ethnically diverse character to what would become New York. Maryland, founded as a Catholic haven in 1634, and Pennsylvania, established by Quaker William Penn in 1681 as a refuge for religious dissenters of various kinds, added further cultural variety to the colonial landscape. By the early 18th century, 13 English colonies stretched along the Atlantic seaboard from Massachusetts to Georgia, each with its own particular character, governance structure, and economic base, yet sharing enough common experiences and grievances to eventually find common political purpose. Calls for change were already growing louder with each passing decade. The political ideas that drove the American Revolution did not emerge suddenly from frustration with British taxation policies, though those frustrations provided immediate triggers. They emerged from decades of colonial self-governance experience, from the Enlightenment philosophy that circulated through educated colonial society, from religious traditions that emphasized individual conscience and community covenant, and from a growing sense that colonial interests and British imperial interests were fundamentally misaligned in ways that no amount of parliamentary adjustment could permanently resolve. The Stamp Act of 1765, the Townshend Acts, the Boston Massacre of 1770, the Boston Tea Party of 1773, and the Intolerable Acts of 1774. Each represented British parliamentary assertions of authority that colonial assemblies increasingly refused to accept as legitimate without representation in the body imposing taxation. The First Continental Congress of 1774 demonstrated that the 13 colonies could coordinate their political responses. Thomas Paine's Common Sense, published in January 1776, made the argument for complete independence in language accessible and compelling to ordinary readers throughout the colonies, its democratic radicalism shocking some and inspiring many more. Thomas Jefferson's Declaration of Independence, adopted on July 4, 1776, expressed the political philosophy underlying independence in language of such power and elegance that its core principles, that all men are created equal, endowed with inalienable rights, including life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, have reverberated through every subsequent generation's understanding of what America aspired to be. A nation was about to be born. Winning the Revolutionary War against the world's most powerful military empire required 8 years of grinding conflict, French military and financial assistance, without which the outcome might well have been different, and the sustained military and political leadership of George Washington, whose ability to hold the Continental Army together through defeats, shortages, and the constant threat of dissolution proved as crucial as any battlefield victory. The Treaty of Paris in 1783 recognized American independence and granted the new nation territory extending to the Mississippi River, an enormous domain whose governance required political innovation for which no existing model provided entirely adequate guidance. The Constitution, drafted at Philadelphia in 1787 and ratified by 1788, created a federal republic of carefully balanced powers, its structure reflecting both the founders' classical learning and their practical experience of colonial self-governance, with a system of checks and balances designed to prevent the concentration of power that historical observation suggested was government's permanent temptation. The first 10 amendments, the Bill of Rights, added in 1791, protected individual liberties against government overreach in ways that established constitutional guarantees still debated and applied by courts more than 2 centuries later. George Washington's 2-term presidency and voluntary retirement established the precedent of peaceful transfer of power that would remain the Republic's most important democratic norm. The fundamental contradiction embedded in the founding, a nation declaring universal human equality while institutionalizing slavery, created the unresolved tension whose consequences would eventually produce the Republic's greatest crisis. The frontier was already beckoning. The Louisiana Purchase of 1803, in which President Thomas Jefferson acquired from Napoleon Bonaparte an enormous territory stretching from the Mississippi River to the Rocky Mountains for $15 million, effectively doubled the size of the United States in a single transaction and committed the new republic to a continental destiny that would define its development for a century. The Lewis and Clark Expedition of 1804 to 1806, commissioned by Jefferson to explore this vast new territory, returned with systematic geographic and natural history documentation of extraordinary scope, establishing a foundational body of knowledge about the American West, while also demonstrating that the path to the Pacific Ocean was far more challenging than optimistic Eastern imaginations had supposed. Westward expansion proceeded through the 19th century, driven by multiple overlapping forces. Agricultural land hunger among Eastern farmers, whose growing families needed new ground. The discovery of gold in California in 1848 that triggered the massive migration of the 1849 gold rush. The gradual completion of transportation infrastructure that reduced the practical barriers to Western settlement. And the ideological conviction expressed in the phrase manifest destiny, coined in 1845, that American expansion across the entire continent was not merely advantageous, but divinely ordained. This expansion came at profound and devastating cost to the indigenous nations of the West, whose lands were taken through a combination of treaties, systematically violated, military campaigns, forced relocations, and the destruction of the bison herds upon which Plains Indian cultures depended. Rapid change was bringing new challenges that tested the nation's ideals severely. Between 1820 and 1860, the United States experienced population growth, economic development, and geographic expansion at rates that transformed the young republic beyond recognition, while simultaneously intensifying the internal contradictions that threatened its continued unity. Immigration brought approximately 5 million people to American shores during this period, predominantly from Ireland, fleeing the famine devastation of the 1840s, and from the German states experiencing political upheaval after the failed revolutions of 1848. These newcomers concentrated in the growing cities of the Northeast and Midwest, their labor feeding the industrial and commercial expansion of an economy growing faster than any previous large nation had managed. The railroad network expanding rapidly across the eastern states from the 1830s onward compressed geographic distance and integrated markets in ways that accelerated economic development while also connecting regions of very different character and interests. The slavery question, which the constitutional framers had hoped to manage through compromise and silence, grew increasingly impossible to contain as the question of whether new Western territories would permit or exclude slavery forced a political reckoning that no compromise could permanently postpone. Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin, published in 1852, brought the human reality of slavery to Northern readers who had previously experienced it only as an abstract political controversy, its emotional power generating reactions that confirmed how thoroughly the slavery question had become a moral as well as political crisis. Conflict that would reshape the country was gathering with the unstoppable momentum of a long-delayed storm. The Civil War of 1861 to 1865 was the defining crisis of American history, testing whether the democratic experiment launched in 1776 could survive the fundamental contradiction embedded in its founding. Approximately 620,000 soldiers died, more Americans than in any other conflict before or since, in 4 years of industrialized warfare that demonstrated with devastating thoroughness that modern weapons technology had outpaced the tactical thinking still drawing on Napoleonic models. President Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation of January 1, 1863, transformed the war's meaning by making the abolition of slavery an explicit Union war aim, shifting the conflict's moral character and eventually enabling the recruitment of approximately 180,000 black soldiers into Union forces. The Union's military victory preserved the Republic's territorial integrity and ended chattel slavery through the 13th Amendment. But the Reconstruction period that followed struggled to translate legal freedom into practical equality, as constitutional amendments guaranteeing citizenship and voting rights for Black Americans faced violent resistance throughout the former Confederate states, and eventually a retreat of federal commitment to enforcement. The legacy of Reconstruction's incomplete project, freedom proclaimed but equality denied, rights codified but not protected, would shadow American democracy for another century, driving the civil rights movement of the 20th century, whose goals remained aligned with principles the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments had articulated in the 1860s. From these ashes, however, an economic transformation was accelerating that would make the United States the world's most powerful industrial economy within a generation. The Gilded Age of the late 19th century transformed the United States from a predominantly agricultural economy into the world's leading industrial power, with a speed that astonished contemporary observers throughout the world. The Transcontinental Railroad, completed in 1869 when the Union Pacific and Central Pacific lines met at Promontory Summit in Utah, connected the Atlantic and Pacific coasts across a continent that Lewis and Clark had taken 18 months to traverse, compressing travel time from months to days and integrating the national economy into a single market of extraordinary productive potential. Steel production, organized through the innovative structures pioneered by Andrew Carnegie, made structural steel available at prices that enabled the skyscrapers, bridges, and industrial machinery whose construction defined the era's physical character. Thomas Edison's development of practical electric lighting and the broader electrical grid, Alexander Graham Bell's telephone, and dozens of other innovations emerging from the late 19th century's extraordinary technological creativity transformed daily life at a pace that each generation found simultaneously exhilarating and disorienting. The industrial economy's growth was accompanied by the concentration of wealth in the hands of a relatively small number of extraordinarily successful industrialists and financiers whose power over wages, working conditions, and political processes generated reform movements demanding regulatory limits on corporate power. The progressives, the labor movement, and the trust-busting policies of Theodore Roosevelt's presidency all represented responses to the social consequences of economic transformation that celebrated innovation while acknowledging its costs. America's influence was expanding in every direction. The Spanish-American War of 1898, resulting in the United States acquiring the Philippines, Guam, and Puerto Rico alongside Cuba's practical independence, announced America's arrival as a Pacific as well as Atlantic power and committed the nation to international responsibilities that its founders had neither anticipated nor uniformly desired. President Theodore Roosevelt's big stick foreign policy, the Panama Canal's completion in 1914, a feat of engineering that reshaped global maritime trade routes, and American intervention in the First World War in 1917, each represented steps in a gradual, contested shift from the deliberate continental focus of American foreign policy toward active engagement in global affairs. President Woodrow Wilson's 14 points, presented to the Paris Peace Conference in 1919 as a framework for a stable post-war international order based on national self-determination and collective security through the proposed League of Nations, demonstrated an American idealism about international organization that Senate rejection of League membership then immediately qualified with a retreat toward more limited engagement. The interwar period's prosperity, cultural creativity, and eventual economic catastrophe, the Great Depression beginning in 1929 and devastating the lives of millions of Americans, demonstrated how thoroughly the United States had become integrated into global economic systems that no national policy could entirely insulate from international developments. Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal response to the Depression, expanding federal government's role in economic stabilization and social insurance, permanently altered the relationship between citizens and their national government. The 20th century had barely begun. The Second World War pulled the United States into global conflict with a clarity that the first had not quite achieved. The Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, uniting American public opinion in support of war with an immediacy that years of preceding political debate had not managed. American industrial mobilization for the war effort demonstrated productive capacity that exceeded any previous national achievement, with factories that had produced automobiles converting to build tanks, aircraft manufacturers expanding to output thousands of planes monthly, and a workforce that included unprecedented numbers of women in industrial roles that permanently altered social assumptions about what women could and should do. The Manhattan Project, which developed the atomic bomb through a secret program involving some of the world's most brilliant physicists working at sites across the country, produced the weapon dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945 that ended the Pacific War, while simultaneously introducing humanity to a new era of existential risk, whose management would define international relations for decades. The post-war period brought the Marshall Plan's reconstruction assistance to devastated European economies, the creation of international institutions, including the United Nations and the International Monetary Fund, and the beginning of the Cold War competition with the Soviet Union that organized American foreign policy for over 4 decades. Domestically, the GI Bill's educational and housing benefits helped create the suburban middle class, whose consumer culture became globally influential. New frontiers were opening in ways no previous generation had imagined. On July 20, 1969, Neil Armstrong stepped from the Apollo 11 lunar module onto the surface of the moon, fulfilling President Kennedy's 1961 commitment to land a human being on the moon before the end of the decade, and achieving what remains the most audacious single act of exploration in human history. The Apollo program represented the culmination of a space race initiated by Soviet launch of the Sputnik satellite in 1957, whose demonstration that the USSR had rocket capability to reach orbit shocked American scientific and political confidence into massive investment in science education, research, and the newly created NASA. Between 1961 and 1972, 12 American astronauts walked on the moon, returning samples and data that transformed human understanding of the solar system's formation, while simultaneously broadcasting images that gave the entire planet a new perspective on Earth's fragility as a blue sphere suspended in the blackness of space. The technologies developed for the space program, miniaturized electronics, advanced materials, computational improvements, found their way into commercial and medical applications that benefited millions of people who never thought particularly about space exploration. The scientific infrastructure built during this period, including the network of research universities, national laboratories, and government research agencies, created to compete technologically with the Soviet Union, provided the institutional foundation from which subsequent decades of American scientific leadership would emerge. The digital revolution was already taking its first crucial steps. The development of digital computing and the Internet transformed human civilization with an impact comparable to the printing press, concentrating an extraordinary proportion of that transformation in American institutions, companies, and culture. The foundations of digital computing, built in universities and government laboratories during the 1940s through 1960s, gave way to commercial development that, beginning with the personal computer revolution of the late 1970s, gradually placed computing power in the hands of individual users rather than exclusively within large institutions. Apple's Macintosh, IBM's PC, and the software industry that grew around them created an entirely new economic sector, concentrated particularly in California's Silicon Valley, where proximity to Stanford and Berkeley, venture capital networks, and an entrepreneurial culture combined to create the most productive concentration of technology innovation in history. The Internet, developed from military and academic networks into a global communications
In advanced labs,
infrastructure
scientists
through the
unlocked divots of
1990s,
tomorrow, harnessing the power of wind and
commerce,
sun on the open sea,
communication,
exploring
culture,
the cosmos
and
with
political
satellites and
organizing,
space stations,
consequences
building
still
sustainable
accelerating
cities where
today.
nature and technology
Amazon,
thrive.
Google,
A connected
Facebook,
world empowered
and
by
thousands of
innovation.
other companies built upon internet infrastructure created economic value and cultural influence of extraordinary scale, their platforms reaching billions of users worldwide and making American technology companies among the most valuable and influential organizations in human history. The smartphone revolution of the early 21st century placed internet-connected computing in the pockets of billions of people worldwide, extending American technological influence into the daily lives of people on every inhabited continent. America was entering a new century shaped by these digital transformations. The United States of the 21st century is a nation of approximately 330 million people, drawn from virtually every national, ethnic, and cultural background on Earth. Its diversity reflecting both the historic waves of immigration that built the country across centuries and the continuing movement of people toward a society that, despite persistent inequalities and contradictions, offers genuine opportunities that attract people from throughout the world. The demographic transformation of America through successive immigration waves, Irish and German in the mid-19th century, Eastern and Southern European through the early 20th century, Asian and Latin American through the late 20th and early 21st centuries, has repeatedly tested and repeatedly renewed the country's capacity for cultural integration while maintaining a national identity flexible enough to accommodate constant change without losing coherence. The civil rights movement of the 1950s and 1960s, whose leaders, including Rosa Parks, Martin Luther King Jr., and John Lewis, challenged the systematic racial discrimination that had denied Black Americans the rights nominally guaranteed since Reconstruction, achieved landmark legislation in the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965 that represented the most significant expansion of American democracy since the post-Civil War amendments. Subsequent movements for gender equality, LGBTQ rights, disability rights, and the rights of other historically marginalized communities continued the pattern of democratic expansion through organized civic action that the civil rights movement had demonstrated was possible. This diversity, with all its tensions and creative energy, was becoming America's most distinctive and defining characteristic. No honest account of America's story can overlook the continent's extraordinary geographic diversity, which shaped the cultures, economies, and identities of every community that has ever lived within it, and continues influencing American life in ways that purely political or economic history consistently underestimates. The Rocky Mountains and the Sierra Nevada, whose snow-capped peaks, visible for hundreds of miles across the western landscape, created barriers to east-west movement that channeled migration, shaped regional development, and gave the American West its distinctive character of dramatic contrast between high country and desert basin. The Mississippi River system, draining the vast interior of the continent and connecting the Great Plains to the Gulf of Mexico through a network of navigable waterways, made the American heartland one of the world's most productive agricultural regions, while also creating the natural transportation routes that shaped where settlements grew and how commerce flowed across the interior. The Atlantic and Pacific coastlines, with their natural harbors, fisheries, and maritime connections to international trade, built the commercial civilizations of the eastern seaboard and the Pacific ports that integrated American productivity into global markets. The Great Plains, whose deep topsoil represents millions of years of accumulated organic material, became the breadbasket of an industrialized world whose feeding depended on the extraordinary productivity that American farmers achieved with the combination of rich soil, adequate rainfall, and technological innovation. America's greatest legacy was being built in every landscape simultaneously. America's tradition of innovation. The expectation, embedded deep in its culture, that problems can be solved through creative application of intelligence, determination, and resources, has produced contributions to science, technology, art, and culture, whose global influence is genuinely difficult to measure, but impossible to ignore. American universities, built upon the land-grant tradition established by the Morrill Act of 1862 and expanded through the 20th century into the world's most productive research system, have trained generations of scientists, engineers, physicians, and scholars from throughout the world while generating basic research whose applications have ranged from antibiotics to the internet to GPS navigation. The American entertainment industry, Hollywood film, Broadway theater, jazz music born in New Orleans, rock and roll emerging from the blues tradition, hip-hop developed in the South Bronx, has exercised cultural influence on global popular culture that no other single national tradition has matched. Its products reaching audiences on every inhabited continent and shaping the cultural reference points of multiple generations worldwide. Medical innovation centered in American research institutions has produced vaccines, treatments, and surgical techniques that have saved hundreds of millions of lives globally, from the polio vaccine developed by Jonas Salk through the mRNA vaccine technology that enabled rapid COVID-19 vaccine development. Agricultural innovations developed in American universities and research institutions. The Green Revolution techniques that dramatically increased crop yields in developing countries have contributed directly to reducing global hunger. One final chapter remained to complete this remarkable story. Behind the constitutional documents and the military victories, beneath the technological innovations and the cultural achievements, supporting the political institutions and the economic structures, there have always been the individual people whose ordinary lives constitute the actual substance of American civilization across its entire history. The indigenous families, who maintained their cultural traditions across centuries of displacement and dispossession, preserving languages, ceremonies, and community bonds against pressures designed to erase them, represent a resilience whose depth and significance American history has not always adequately recognized or honored. The enslaved men and women who built much of the American South's agricultural wealth through their uncompensated labor, who created cultural traditions of extraordinary richness and spiritual depth within conditions of extreme oppression, and whose descendants' long struggle for full equality became one of democracy's most important test cases. The immigrant families who arrived at Ellis Island and later through other ports of entry with little more than determination, who worked the hardest jobs, lived in the most crowded conditions, and built the communities whose accumulated effort contributed to American prosperity. The farmers of the Great Plains, whose drought-resistant persistence through the Dust Bowl devastation of the 1930s exemplified the stubbornness that rural America consistently demonstrated in the face of environmental and economic challenge. The workers who organized unions, the women who organized for suffrage and equality, the scientists who worked through decades of seemingly unpromising research toward breakthroughs that changed the world. These people, named and unnamed, are America's greatest achievement. The journey comes full circle. From ancient landscapes where the first Americans followed mammoths across the Bering Land Bridge into an unknown continent, to the gleaming city skylines whose light is visible from space on clear nights, America's story spans an arc of human achievement, tragedy, resilience, and transformation that 15,000 years have not finished writing. From countless communities whose diversity reflects every culture on Earth, drawn together into one nation, whose meaning remains genuinely contested and genuinely vital, America demonstrates that national identity can be built from something other than ethnic or linguistic homogeneity. That a shared commitment to evolving ideals, however imperfectly realized in practice, can constitute the foundation of something durable and worthy of continuation. From the indigenous civilizations that built Cahokia and Chaco Canyon, to the colonial founders who declared principles they could not yet fully honor, from the immigrants who crossed oceans for the chance to build better lives, to the scientists whose discoveries changed how humanity understood the universe, from the civil rights leaders who held the country to its own stated principles, to the entrepreneurs whose technological innovations reshaped global civilization, America's story is one of continual transformation. Across thousands of years, the people, ideas, and landscapes of this continent helped shape a nation whose influence continues reaching across the world. Not because that influence has always been wise or just, but because the democratic ideals at its core, the creativity of its people, and the extraordinary diversity of its communities continue generating possibilities that the world continues watching. The American story is not finished. It is still being written.